Hello, San Diego. My name is Peter Miller. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have had the honor of showing a number of my films in San Diego at the San Diego Jewish Film Festival and sharing my documentaries with the wonderful audiences there. We're in a very unusual time now where we're doing our film programming virtually. And I wanted to speak with you about one film that I had the pleasure of showing there and really thinking about what a magnificent thing it was to show the film there. But first, let me talk about this movie. It's called Refugee Kids, One Small School Takes on the World. It's a short documentary that I made along with Renee Silverman, a friend and filmmaker who had been invited by friends who worked at the International Rescue Committee's Summer Youth Academy for Refugee Children. It's an annual summer school for kids who have newly arrived as refugees in the United States. And in 6 weeks, every summer in New York City, these children, about 100 kids, have a crash course on being an American school kid. They go to a classroom in a normal American school building, and they have American school teachers during the summer showing them not just how to speak English and how to be in an American classroom and what the books and what the methods look like, but to be in a classroom full of kids from all over the world and to understand what it is to be a part of an American school community. It's, over the course of 6 weeks, almost magical to witness this process. You have kids who come in having just arrived in the country, and before long, kids from every continent, from Asia and Africa and Latin America, from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, coming together to form this, in many ways, ideal American community of people ranging from kindergarten to 12th grade, going to school in America for the very first time and getting ready for September when they're going to go off to New York City public schools and have to brave that experience. We were given unbelievable access to film inside this school over the course of 6 weeks. We were there nearly every day, and we got to meet and know some kids. And we realized quickly, that you kind of do a casting. You say, who among these 100 kids are going to tell us something that we'd like to know? And we met a handful of amazing children whose stories we tell, not just of what they see in school and how they learn and what goes on in the classroom, but also what their lives were like. We meet George, who was a refugee from Liberia, whose much of his family, parents and grandparents, had been killed in the violence there, living in a very tough neighborhood in New York City. And yet, somehow, through it all, one of the most serene, wise, and compassionate human beings I've ever had the privilege of meeting. And we followed George, from his home to the school. It's practically a 2-hour commute. And he has become a youth leader where he helps his fellow students. And yet, all the while, he's having to provide for his family. He's a teenage kid, go through all of these awful things, and yet is this remarkably optimistic young man. We meet a couple of kids from the Middle East, one of them Christian and one of them Muslim, who didn't know each other. One was from Iraq and the other was from Egypt. And they might have been enemies somewhere else in the world, but in the summer academy in New York City, they become buddies. And they realize that what draws them together is friendship and humanity, which is really why a school like this can work and why our country can live up to its responsibility to be a place that welcomes people from other places and throws them together in New York City or wherever in the country people end up, and make a way for themselves in a country that has always been made up of people from other countries on Earth. So Renee and I started this film several years back when the issue of refugee resettlement was not controversial. It was just a good thing that we did. There was a bunch of agencies that were involved in bringing refugees over from other countries and from refugee camps and helping them find their way to housing and jobs and schools and all the things they need to do to become oriented in the United States. And then along comes the current administration, which starts slamming the doors on the refugees who desperately need to come here. And our little movie, which had been, something of a pleasant film about a nice school that welcomes refugees in, suddenly took on a much greater meaning and became something that we could use in communities to say, when we shut the doors on refugees, here's what we lose. We lose George and Magdi and Omid and Rigzin and Tashi and Helen and these kids that you meet in our film who are so wonderful and are going to be such a wonderful part of America. We should really think about what we're doing when we don't welcome refugees into this country and how much better we are when we do. So we started making this movie. We filmed for a summer. Of course, as with all documentary filmmaking, we were having trouble figuring out how to pay for it. And so a few years went by before we were able to wrap the film up. And we decided that since a few years had gone by, we'd go and we'd visit with the kids and see what had happened in their lives and where they had gone. And over the course of 39 minutes, which is how long this film is, we watched these kids go from being, shy new arrivees at this refugee summer school to being part of this community, and then several years later to thriving and finding their way. And oftentimes, the teenagers especially become the person in their families who really helps the family find their way in this new land. The kids who can learn the language and can learn the banking and the real estate and the logistics and the bureaucracy and deal with all of that. And so you see these kids who are, 17 years old, trying to just live a normal life, but caring for their families and dealing with the after effects of having lived in a refugee camp and all these things, and are magnificent presences in our movie. This is the DVD of Refugee Kids, One Small School Takes on the World. We showed this film in San Diego at, I think, one of my favorite screenings I've ever done. I've shown films in big movie theaters, and I've shown films in classrooms, and I've shown films on TV. But when you can show a film in a room and it creates change, there's something quite special about that. And we showed the film at the Leash Tag Foundation has a campus up in Encinitas where we showed it in a kind of auditorium where the film festival sometimes showed its films. And we showed the movie, and then afterwards they did a couple of minutes of question and answer with me, the filmmaker, which was interesting, but not very. And then they said, okay, let's bring in people who are working with refugees in the community, people from Jewish Family Services of San Diego who are actively involved with resettling refugees in San Diego, people from the school system who are working with refugee children in the schools there, other people who had been volunteers. It was this fantastic conversation about how the story that we told in our movie reflected the reality of what was going on locally in San Diego. And because people had been brought into this world and saw the kids in our film and then met the people locally who were doing stuff, suddenly there was this uprising of, let's figure out how we can support this kind of work locally. Clipboards went around with sign-up sheets. People started volunteering. Out of this screening that the film festival put together, connections were made, and people got involved in doing this really important work locally. And part of the joy of being able to make documentary films is when you see your film have the capacity to spark a conversation that gets people involved, that creates the opportunity for action and creates the opportunity for change. And if there's any reason to do what I do, which is to make documentary films, that's it. And it's been a joy to do this in collaboration with the amazing film programming community in San Diego who has made opportunities like this possible. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and stay safe.